Please join me in welcoming Delaine Eastin.
Well, good morning, Gauchos. It's my honor to be here today. I thank all of you for all you're doing on behalf of this wonderful school. I did take one class in the School of Education. It was not yet named the Gevirtz School because when I went on, I was a teacher at community college and I learned some things in that class, and I've always been very appreciative of the work of this wonderful school and the people who are here. Thank you all. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, John, and all of you who have helped me. There's a little mistake in there. I actually graduated from UC Santa Barbara in 1971. So I was here for the burning of the bank. I was working 3 jobs, and so it was, I didn't have a lot of time to burn banks, but it was a very interesting time to be sure. And I want to just say to all of you, thank you for being warriors for education. So there's some amnesia that's happening among some people in this state. They seem to have forgotten how we got here. The Silicon Valley was not born here because of a confluence of rivers. We have no Tigris and no Euphrates. What we had was an amazing commitment by a generation of people who came out of a depression and a war and decided to build the finest education system the world had ever seen. I want to give you some perspective because first let me just give a shout out to my own parents. Today would have been their 76th wedding anniversary, January 16th. Only in California can you have this hillbilly from Kentucky who winds up in the Navy during the Second World War, comes to San Francisco. His parents, Maud and Dudley Eastin, were both teetotaling members of the Western Christian Temperance Union. My father fell in love with a San Franciscan whose father had been a bootlegger during Prohibition and who then owned a liquor store and a bar. So in California, anything is possible. And I say one of my father's favorite quotes was, Californians are people born somewhere else who came to their senses. So I hope you're all, those of you who have come here to go to graduate school, I hope you're enjoying yourself. Samantha said she was for sure. Let me just give you some perspective. When I left to go to UC Davis, 9 out of 10 campuses of the University of California were built and opened. The year was 1965. Since 65, we built 1 UC. And in fact, since 1985, we've only built 3 of the 23 CSUs. Since 1985, we only built 9 of the 114 community colleges. Do the math. That adds up to 13 campuses since 1985. In that same period of time, we built 23 prisons. Ladies and gentlemen, if budgets are statements of values, that is a pretty pathetic statement. So I'm here to tell you, first, you are doing the most important work in America, and that is educating our children, supporting them. Some of you I know are going to be counselors, and in a host of different arenas will be helping our kids. But the reality is, it is the most important work. It is the deciding ingredient in the success of a state or a nation, in the success of a community or a family. It is, in fact, about who we're going to be as well as who we are. So let me just give you a little perspective. When I started to school, my dad was still in the Navy. He had joined the Navy in 1931. Great Depression is on. His father goes bankrupt. Somebody didn't pay him for a load of logs he cut. Hiram Wolf Mountain Tie Company deprived him of his pay. These Kentuckians are storytellers. And that's why I wear boots a lot, but in case it gets deep. But the fact is their house burned down. And so my dad was accepted at Eastern Kentucky University, but they couldn't send him. He had a brother there, and so he went into the Navy to send money home to help his brother to graduate. And he went around the world. He was in Colombia and Haiti and Dominican Republic, and finally he spent 3 years in China. He was on the last ship to leave China before Pearl Harbor. They stopped at the Philippines 3 days before the Japanese invaded. And then he got to Australia and finally came back and met my mother in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the bottom line, though, is when I was starting school, they were living in San Francisco because my dad was stationed at Mare Island. My mother was from San Francisco. We were living with my grandparents. And so I was in a classroom in San Miguel School, public school in San Francisco, where there were 44 children. And my folks looked around. They're going to buy their first, turns out their only house. And they could have bought a bigger house for less money. You know what? They bought the little house that cost more. You know why? The schools were better. And so I went from a classroom of 44 to a classroom of 20. Some of you remember that as state superintendent of public instruction, I fought to reduce class size in kindergarten through third grade to 20 or less. And that was the reason. The teacher in San Francisco was a good teacher, but she had 44 kids. The teacher in San Carlos was a good teacher, and she only had 20 kids. And so those kids were further along. Ladies and gentlemen, today in California, the class size is the largest in the United States of America. That's okay, though, because our kids aren't very diverse, right? Our kids are really rich, too, right? No, we have the most diverse student population, the highest number and percentage of English learners, highest number and percentage of poor kids. We should have not be near the bottom in per pupil spending, not be at the worst as class size, not have the fewest counselors, nurses, librarians. We should be near the top. This is one of the reasons they're striking in Los Angeles. Class size, counselors, nurses, librarians. Do these people matter? Well, it was Miss Firth, the librarian at Britton Acres Elementary School, who took me aside and said, "Honey, you like to read. Could I recommend some books for you?" I said, "Oh, yes." She had me read every biography about a woman. And there weren't that many, but it was important that I read them. And so the librarian was really important to me. It was the nurse who called my mother in the 4th grade and said, "Get that girl's eyes checked. I think she needs glasses." And I did. I walked out of the ophthalmologist office with my glasses and thought, wow, you can see the leaves on the trees from this far away? I didn't know. Oh, and is the counselor important? My first day at Carlmont High School, counselor called me into her office and bawled me out. My parents didn't go to college. I didn't know the difference between college prep and university prep. She said, "You need to be in university prep." I'm in college prep. Was a little easier, I confess. And so she made me change and get in university prep. She's the reason I got in the University of California. My parents wouldn't have known what I should take. These people really are important. And so I say to each and every one of you, the reality is that we need to make this a priority. And by the way, when I was accepted at UC Davis, girls could not borrow money until they were 21. Boys could borrow at 18. Some of you don't realize they put women in the Civil Rights Act, and that changed when I was 20. But until then, your parents had to borrow the money, not on a 4% loan over 10 years, which you didn't have to start paying on until 9 months after graduation. No, they had to borrow the money at 7.5% over 3 years. And so my mother said, "Honey, why don't you go to community college?" I talked to the branch manager, who had also said, "After all, she's your daughter, I can't tell you how many girls I knew who didn't go to college whose brothers did. Because some of the older people in the room are nodding their heads. The families would often say to the girls, "Well, honey, you're going to get your MRS degree." So my mother wanted me to go to community college because they were going to be paying twice their house payment. I went into my father in a very mature voice. I said, "Daddy Sugar says I can't go." And my father said, "Well, let's go talk to your mother." He always called her Sugar when he was happy with her, but when he was mad, he called her Dottie. And he said, "Dottie, what's this about Delaine not going to Davis?" She said, "Hank, I talked to the branch manager. We'd have to borrow the money at 7.5% for 3 years. We'd be paying twice our house payment." He said, "We have to find a way." And my mother got kind of snooty and said, "Well, what do you suggest we do? Take a second mortgage out on the house?" My father thought for a minute, and he said, "We'll sell the damned house if we have to. She's going to Davis." Still shakes me up. So what happens? I arrived in Davis, sight unseen. We'd never gone to visit campuses. I arrived at Davis in the backseat of a 1955 Studebaker. They needed a new car, but they sent their daughter to college. They needed a new couch, but they sent their daughter to college. They wanted to go to family reunion because my father's mother had just died, but they didn't go. They sent their daughter to college. Budgets are statements of values. And so I tell you this because First, some of you don't know that this originally, there was a teacher's college here in Santa Barbara, California called the Anna Blake School. You really the heirs of something that happened in 1891. And so we all ought to be proud of the long-time commitment to education. But we also have to understand that we need our leaders to understand the importance of education. Now, I ran for governor not thinking that I could win, really, but because I was so frustrated that none of the candidates were talking about education. Not preschool, not K-12, and not higher ed. The fact is, I raised the flag and a bunch of people saluted. Antonio Villaraigosa was kind enough at one of the forums to give me a shout out, to say we weren't talking education until Delaine got in this race. I want to thank her for doing that. But we all have to talk about education. It is not okay to cite a big number and say, look what we're doing, when you have to understand the cost of living in California. So we are near the bottom, and we need to improve a lot more than even this budget calls for. I'm thrilled about the preschool. I had a universal preschool task force. The report came out in 1998. It called for universal preschool within 10 years. That was 20 years ago. We are behind Oklahoma and Georgia. The native Californians I know are horrified, and the adopted Californians are too. There's no excuse for this state to be behind Oklahoma and Georgia when it comes to providing preschool opportunities. It's disgraceful. The fact is, kindergarten needs to be full day and mandatory. When working parents can't get off at noon to go pick up their kindergartner. And the truth is that right now there are child care families that are in San Francisco that have 2 kids in child care are paying $3,400 a month. That's a house payment. And so we have college-educated couples that cannot afford to buy a home because they are too busy trying to educate their littlest children. And I will say to all of you, I got into this honestly, and when I first got to the legislature, I'd been involved with schools in my area, and they were appalled by the quality of our school's library collection. We were dead last in the country. It was a 1987 study that showed California not only had the fewest number of titles per student, because we'd been growing rapidly and hadn't been buying library books, there was no commitment to it, but we also had the fewest number of periodicals, the oldest reference materials, and so forth. And so I set out looking at some of these books. I have a garage shelf. If you ever get to Davis, come see me. I have books that will make you sick to your stomach. There is one called Rockets into Space. I actually have 3 or 4 of these that say, this is 1987, in a few years, men in spacesuits will walk on the moon, end quote. That was 20 years after we had been to the moon. We have, the most disgusting was probably a book called Men at Arms, which described different armies and different warriors around the world. The chapter on Africa was called African Savages. It is disgusting. But let me just read to you from I'm Glad I'm a Boy, I'm Glad I'm a Girl. I think you'll get a real kick out of this one. Boys are doctors, girls are nurses. Boys are policemen, girls are meter maids. Boys are presidents, girls are first ladies. Boys fix things, girls need things fixed. Boys can eat, girls can cook. Boys invent things, girls use what boys invent. Boys build houses, girls keep houses. You get the picture here? A lot of really inappropriate information in a California school library in the late 80s. And so, during my first term, I earmarked money for California school library books. Governor George Deukmejian vetoed my bill. It was actually the nicest veto I ever got. He wrote, the author has a noble purpose, but she must identify a revenue stream. So I went to the chair of Rev. Tax, Johan Clays, and I said, I need money. He says, I got some money for you, but I don't think you can get the bill out of committee. I said, tell me. He said, well, we have relatively low cigarette taxes, and we really did at that time. But we have no tax on chewing tobacco, snuff, pipe tobacco, wait for it, cigars. If you just raised the taxes on those products up to where cigarettes were, you'd get $36 million for school libraries, back when $36 million was real money. And so I carried that bill. Johan said, you probably can't get it out of committee. I said, oh, why wouldn't I? I showed up at the committee hearing. You could smoke in the Capitol at that time, and 2 of the members came in smoking cigars. 2 of them came in smoking cigarettes. The bill did not get out of committee. Do you realize that the only cigarette taxes that have passed in most of your lifetimes have been because of initiatives that people put on the ballot. Finally, the legislature put one on the ballot. They didn't have the courage to just vote it in. They made you vote for it, and you did. But the truth be known, right now we have got to understand something. We have got to increase investment. But what's really missing in Sacramento, 3 things: courage, vision, and heart. Think about it. Courage is things like the Morrill Act. Do you know what the Morrill Act is? Your dean knows. It was a bill that James Buchanan vetoed. James Buchanan, widely thought to be the worst president in history, but he's getting real competition right now. Anyway, James Buchanan, John told me to make you laugh, so I'm working at it. James Buchanan vetoed the bill, and then Abe Lincoln comes in and he's got a civil war, and of course he shouldn't have signed the bill. What did the bill say? It dreamed that every state would have at least one land-grant college. Lincoln never lived to see any of it. But he signed that bill, and does every state have a land-grant college? You bet your life. There's 181 of them. You know them with names like UC Berkeley, UC Santa Barbara, UC Davis. It's Duke, it's Purdue, it's so many great schools, but it's all because Lincoln had the courage, the vision, and the heart. And in the Second World War, Roosevelt did a wild thing. He signed the GI Bill of Rights, guaranteeing soldiers and sailors, mostly men, would get to go to college with help from the federal government. There were people who made fun of him. It was too expensive, Mr. President. He didn't live to see that he had doubled the number of people in college with the GI Bill of Rights. Helped some people buy houses, too. Fact is that in 1946, there was a draft. You know, there was a draft in 41, 42, 43, 44, and 45. But in 46, they turned away a record number of young men from the draft. They were only men drafted. 19-year-olds were turned away in record numbers. Why? Crooked spines, foreshortened limbs, bad teeth, bad eyesight. Why were they worse than 41 to 45? Those were the children whose developmental years had occurred during the Great Depression. Malnourishment. And so if you look at the bill that Truman signed, it says, the health of our nation's children being a matter of national security, the Congress does ordain and establish the National School Lunch Act. Betsy DeVos has never read it. The reality is that in Dwight David Eisenhower, and you'll notice I use 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans because this should not be a partisan conversation. Dwight David Eisenhower, when Sputnik went up, a bunch of people said, we can't be thinking about education. We've got a Cold War on top of a space race. What Eisenhower said, we need to think about education because we need scientists, engineers, and teachers. And so he signed that bill into law and created the National Defense Education Act, which is the College Student Loan Act. It's because of national defense. I say to all of you, every single one of those important initiatives was a hard fight. None of them were slam dunks. None of them were as obvious as they are to the people in this room right now. So education needs to be a driving force. I am thrilled that Gavin Newsom is talking about 2 years of free community college. We also, though, have to reduce the fees for attending the CSU and the University of California. When I went to UC Davis, I'm glad you're sitting down, you may want to sit down, it was $82.50 a semester. My best friend went to San Jose State, it was $42 a semester. If you adjust for inflation, it still would have been less than $1,000 a year. I had to pay an extra $1,000 a year to go to the graduate school. What are you paying? A lot more than that. And so I just say to all of you, we have to have a conversation about lowering the fees and building more campuses. Do you realize how many rural parts of this state, talented, able children, do not go to college? Because the nearest community college is hundreds of miles away. And so I had teachers, I visited schools in all 58 counties. So I've been to Hayfork. Did you know there's a Loyalton and a Likely? I've been to a lot of corners of California, and there's a lot of principals and teachers and parents who told me, our kids are smart as anybody else's kids, but they just can't go all the way over to the only campus in this county or the county in the next county. There are counties that have no campuses, Amador. And so I say to all of you, it's really time that, yes, I salute the improvements in this year's budget, and I'm really thrilled about it. But we also have to understand that too many people in Sacramento and in government generally don't know the difference between expense and investment. You want to, of course, hold your expenses down. That's a smart thing to do. The dean understands it. Everybody understands it. But you have to know when to invest. The donors who are here are investing in the future of education in California. But we need the whole state to invest in the future of California. Speaking as the first in my family to go to college, and I have a bunch of cousins that got to go from various parts of our state. But the truth is that was my grandmother told everybody the most important thing you can have in this world is to have an education. So even though not all of her children got to go, her grandkids, of the 18 grandchildren, and all the children didn't live to adulthood, there were 13, 9 lived to adulthood, 18 grandchildren. One was a Down syndrome, one did not get a degree, 2 got AA degrees, they're both in their 80s in Kentucky, and they taught school with an AA degree, and 14 of us have at least a bachelor's degree. It's life-changing. We live well. We live much better than our own parents lived, but not just monetarily, in terms of satisfaction, in terms of choices in life. With an education, if you get in a cul-de-sac with some thug as a boss, you can walk away, but you can't necessarily if you don't have those options. So there's a bunch of things we need to do in this state. I'm for paid maternity leave. I honestly think if you knew what the rest of the world was doing, you'd be shocked. Some people get 6 weeks, but it's not paid. Some people get partially paid. Yes, of course, we ought to give people at least 9 months of paid maternity leave, and it ought to be fully paid. And guess what? The rest of the first world has figured that out. Why can't we? Germany gets up to 3 years paid vacation. Hello. It's not a vacation anyway. But, of course, as you know. So let me just say to all of you that if the greatest generation, a bunch of people that came out of a depression and a war, could figure out how to do for the next generation what those people did here in California and in other states, then surely we can figure this out now. California, as I mentioned, is in the bottom 10 of the 50 states in per pupil spending. Those are not my values, and I don't think they're the values of anybody in this town. But I want you to know what's in the state constitution, because a bunch of people in Sacramento have never read it. It's Article 16, Section 8, quote, "From all revenues, there shall first be set apart the monies to be applied by the state for the support of the public school system and public institutions of higher education," end quote. Everybody's so worried about those few words that say, in order to maintain a well-ordered militia, we have the right to keep and bear arms. How about those words? How about upholding those words? Because when you get sworn in California, you take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the state and the Constitution of the United States. And I just say to you, right now we have some work to do. First, California needs to plan. You want to know how the billion-dollar repair at Oroville happened? It was because the last water plan was done in 1957. Governor Brown, Pat Brown, he also did a long-range higher ed plan. That was the last higher ed plan. That was done in 1960. What year is it? Next year, that will be 60 years since we did the higher ed master plan. That's ridiculous. So it's time to plan. It's time to invest, especially in education at all levels, but also in housing and environmental safety, including banning fracking in a state that had earthquakes before they were fashionable. The fact is, I was here the year after the Platform 9 blowout. And when you walked on the beach, you came back and your feet were as black as the chairs in this room. You had to get gasoline to get the tar off your feet. There were dead birds and dead sea life all over the coast. Of course, we shouldn't be drilling off the coast. But what we need is courage, vision, and heart. That's what will change the course of events. I urge you all to have a glorious career in education, but stay engaged and involved. Give thought not only to what you're doing on a school site or with this individual child, but help your local school boards to figure out what they need to be doing, what they can be doing. Help us change California. You know, everybody talks about how Prop 13, which changed the commercial industrial property tax as well as home property tax. Everybody emphasized what it would do with the homeowners, and it did help homeowners, but it helped the commercial industrial much more. You know, Richmond schools are now West Contra Costa. Do you realize that the Chevron plant should have given them another $100 million over the last 40 years? Think how much better Richmond schools would be if they'd gotten that money. Many of the oil refineries don't ever see their taxes increased. It's time for a periodic increase in property tax for commercial and industrial, even if they haven't changed hands. And by the way, I think they should have been reassessed when 50% of the stock turned over. But if we directed that money into education, we could dramatically increase support for education across this state. And I say to you, when Prop 13 passed, they talk about how it won in a landslide. You've all heard that, right? It didn't get 66 2/3% vote. It didn't reach a threshold it requires us to meet to pass a local parcel tax. And by the way, we changed the local tax requirement to 55% to build the buildings, but it's still 66 2/3 to staff the buildings. Here's a little thing to remember. If you can send your child to a beautiful school with a lousy teacher, or have your child taught by Socrates sitting on a rock, go with Socrates and the rock. At the end of the day, I'll just say, when I travel the world and I ask you, yes, look at what they're doing in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. It's good to look at New Hampshire and Vermont, but look at Germany, look at France, look at Holland, look at Italy and Japan and China. Understand that much of the world looked at America and said, how did they get so rich? Oh, they educated their children. Let's do that. It's time for us to reawaken ourselves, recommit ourselves to the children. I will say one other thing to all of you here, Gevirtz, faculty, staff, and supporters, but especially to the students. My favorite quote is Neil Postman's. He said, "Children are living messages we send to a time we will never see. What is our message to the future?" I know that Hank and Dottie, 76 years ago, got together and figured out how to help their daughter have a wonderful life by giving her a wonderful education. We ought to do that for every machinist's daughter, every dress clerk's daughter. It ought to be our absolute #1 priority as a state and a nation. Thank you all very much for the chance to be here.